if Washington can pull that off and keep Tavita, keep Blau, keep David Rye, the tight ends coach, keep Bobby Johnson, keep Anthony Lynn. Like, I do think there's a really good chance that they keep a lot of the staff, and that'll be really cool to see moving forward and what they can do with Jaden Daniels in year 2. Some breaking news, actually. Great news that I would say it was expected. Kliff Kingsbury staying. That reported by... Max, you want to go full woo into the microphone?
Hooray!
Was that a hooray or a woo?
It was a woo.
The first one looked like a woo, and then I said, do that in the microphone, and you went, hooray! And I was like, that's not what you said. Hooray, woo! Woo, hooray! Kliff Kingsbury's not going anywhere. That's excellent news. But it's also expected. Like, Kliff said all along he was having the most fun he's had in a long time. Okay, why do people leave things they're doing that are the most fun that they've had, the most fulfilling they've had? Money. Could Kliff have gotten more money if he went to the Saints and got a head coaching job? Yeah. Or the Saints going to pay top of the market money for a head coach? Nope. Is Kliff already making head coach money because the Arizona Cardinals gave him an extension a year before firing him, and thus he is getting paid until 2027? Yes. Yes, that is true. So he is probably making close to $10 million a year. I think it's probably 7.5. I think it's 7.5 from Arizona, and he's probably making 2+ here to be the OC. I think Kliff Kingsbury having fun making $10 million a year is probably a very happy Kliff Kingsbury. Why would he be in a rush to go somewhere? And I think the other part of this, Max, that this is so unsurprising that yes, it's news, because he has now formally pulled himself out. He told other teams he wouldn't interview during the Commanders' playoff run, according to Jordan Schultz, who reported this, NFL Insider. And so he hadn't interviewed with New Orleans, for instance, the team that he still was theoretically in the mix for. But, he talked about how he learned a lot from Dan Quinn. He learned a lot from Adam Peters. He looks at the setup here and is like, that's what I want. I realize how important ownership is. I realize how important the relationship was with the GM. Why would he go to New Orleans, where I don't know that he knows Mickey Loomis, the GM down there, and start something from scratch? Like, Kliff knows a lot of people, and I'm not saying he necessarily has to know the GM going in, but I do not see this man leaving for anything short than a no-brainer opportunity. And that's going to be owner, GM, possibly quarterback, but certainly some elements of the roster. And that opportunity didn't exist anywhere this cycle. Nevertheless, what's left in this cycle?
I mean, the only job that was even a maybe was Chicago, and the second that got filled, it was almost a guarantee, at least in my mind, especially just the vibes you would get from him in the press conference. He even said, it would take a lot to leave this kid. And I think he'll be around for a little bit.
I do too. And I think something that's, I guess, underrated about the Lions' success, maybe not underrated, but underappreciated by a casual fan, is the amount of continuity they had on their staff year over year over year. And for them, they got to do that with a quarterback in Jared Goff, who is not the youngest, kind of in that mid-tier, but is also not a superstar, right? But the general star power on their roster plus the continuity is what made them into a 15-win team, the number one in the NFC, number one seed in the NFC, and the favorites until the Commanders knocked them off. And obviously they had a ton of injuries, and they had a kind of wacky game with 5 turnovers and the whole deal. So I'm very curious to see if the Commanders can, for a couple of years, get that level of continuity. And if Jaden obviously can hold that over. I'm curious to see what happens in Detroit as they move on from Ben Johnson and bring in someone else off of that Sean Payton tree. But the thing is, at least for Detroit, Dan Campbell's an offensive coach and is, I think, more capable than people realize of running an offense. If Dan Campbell had to be an OC, he could be an OC. I don't know that he's a great OC, and it certainly is not his highest and best use. Being a head coach and overseeing the whole thing is his highest and best use. But there is a system there that is Dan Campbell's offense that is a supplicant of the I don't know if I use the word supplicant correctly. It's an offshoot. That word I'm 100% sure on. An offshoot of the Sean Payton offense, and he just brought in someone who was in Detroit 2 years ago, left Detroit to go to Denver to coach with Payton, and now is coming back to be his offensive coordinator and the person who runs that and ultimately will call the plays. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing is like they've created something here in DC that's like kind of their own deal. It's like Kliff's offense that he brought from college, married with Anthony Lynn's stuff, married with some of Bobby Johnson's stuff, with Tavita Pritchard's stuff. And, you know, we heard in week 16, the Jamison Crowder touchdown play to win the game is something that, what's his face? David Blau, the assistant quarterbacks coach, like he drew that play up. So they're kind of willing to do anything, which is cool. But Kliff does an excellent job of making it cohesive, and it all works together, and he calls it really well on top of having a good structure to it. So I think that is something that's going to be the ultimate test, since ultimately Kliff will leave, right? Unless all of a sudden they go out and win a Super Bowl and Dan Quinn is like, this competitor's life, I've lived it long enough. I'm retiring and I'm handing the headset to Kliff. And then Kliff gets to stay here. Kliff is going to probably leave. And it might be next year, it might be the year after. Right? 2025, 26 would be next offseason. 27 is the year he stops getting paid by Arizona finally. So either they're not good enough for him to get a head coaching job, or he's probably, with Jaden being the driving force behind the success, going to be good enough that he's in the mix next year and certainly the year after if he wants to sit out one more cycle. Then what? That's the question. I still think it's worth acknowledging that this does not mean that the entire staff is staying in place. That would be incredible if they get that kind of continuity. And Detroit had kind of that. I mean, Antoine Randall was their wide receivers coach for basically the entire time. He just left with Ben for Chicago. Hank Franklin has been their offensive coordinator, or their offensive line coach, which is a really, really important position. And there's a chance that he could still leave in Detroit. But like Randall, Fraley, Johnson, obviously Campbell, Mark Brunell has been their quarterbacks coach for a long time. They had extreme continuity. And that is something that if Washington can pull that off and keep Tavita, keep Blau, keep David Rye, the tight ends coach, keep Bobby Johnson, keep Anthony Lynn, who I'm sure will be coveted, although he's got a pretty good role here. It's going to be hard for him to get, unless he's getting a play-calling OC job, which I don't even know if he wants at this stage in his career. I do think there's a really good chance that they keep a lot of the staff, and that'll be really cool to see moving forward and what they can do with Jaden Daniels in year 2. We'll also see what kind of talent they surround him with, and we'll start talking about some of that, the roster decisions, tomorrow here on the Team 980.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.